who is 25, he actually works for this. He was really lucky. He got a job 2 weeks before all this happened up in New York for an organization called IRAP. It's basically a legal services organization that works to help refugees. So he was living in Brooklyn, and then he moved down here, and now he's heading back up. He and his girlfriend are going to live in a place in the city. And then my younger son, who finished his freshman year of college, is here. Not very happy. And then the big news: my parents, who live outside of New York City, they're in their 80s. We persuaded them, my sisters and I have 3 sisters, to come down here to be safer. And they actually decided they're going to move down here. So they actually bought a place here. So now they went back to New York to get packed up. But we persuaded them to be safer down here. So a lot going on. How about you?
Well, that's good to hear about your family. And I'm sure your younger son is feeling probably what my son is feeling. He wants to go back to school, and my son's not going to even be able to go back when, if and when they do return to any sort of normalcy because of his health. But yeah, same thing. And I'm glad your parents are closer. I mean, that's got to be very comforting to know that they're close by and you can check on them as you need to.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, everybody here is fine. No one is. We haven't gone completely stir crazy. Although there are times throughout the day we look out the window and see if we can jump out. But other than that, everybody's fine. I have my daughter and my son and my husband, and we're here, and we kind of back and forth. Everybody trying to find their own little place where they can, do whatever they need to do.
Right. And you have that really nice backyard.
Yes.
And I know now that you're not bothered by any of the snakes. You're happy to go out there.
Yeah, I grew up with them. So, I recognize them. I mean, my first thing is not to be afraid of them. My first thing is to find out whether they're going to move or am I going to move. And, typically they move. I'm not scared of them, in the ordinary way.
Right.
If they decide to stand up or, come closer to me, I might back up a little bit, but that's about it.
That's sensible.
Yes.
You grew up at some point right in the New York City area, but I guess before that you grew up.
I was born in Brooklyn. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. Okay. The majority of my relatives still live in New York. But as you know, most of them migrated from the South up to New York, but there were a few of them that stayed in the South. And in 1990, my aunt, who lived in Richmond, Virginia, just learned that she had to have a double mastectomy and she needed somebody close to her. And I was trying to go to Richmond, but IBM brought me to North Carolina, and that's how I ended up in North Carolina. And so I could be closer. But yes, I grew up in the South, in a little town called Walterboro, which is not so far from Charleston, but very rural, very poor. Well, at least it was at that time. I don't know what it is now.
I see. Yeah. So you lived there before you went to Brooklyn?
No, I was born in Brooklyn. And so my birth mother was a heroin addict. And so she threw me at 6 months old down a flight of stairs. And so my father, who was in the Air Force, came and got me. He picked me up, bundled me up, and took me to South Carolina to his aunt, to his sister, my paternal aunt, who raised me. And that's how I ended up in the South. And I've been, I think I've lived in almost every city on the East Coast, but I've spent more time here in North Carolina than I've been anywhere else. Okay. So let's start from the beginning, and I'll ask what I ask everybody else. Please tell me your name and share anything with us that you want us to help us get to know you a little bit better, and only what you're comfortable with.
Sure. So I'm Matthew Adler. I teach at Duke Law School. I've been here since 2012. Originally, I grew up in New Rochelle, New York. As Rochelle knows, that's a sort of a city, suburban type city. It's not just a suburb. It's just north of New York City. My backstory is my mother is from New York City. Her parents were working class. They had a small store, tiny sort of candy store. They worked there all the time. and they sent her to this music camp where she met my father, who was from Chicago, more middle class. Anyway, so my parents are still alive, but he traveled around, getting medical training, and then at a certain point, settled in New Rochelle, where I grew up. And I taught, I was lucky to get a law degree. I taught at UPenn Law School from 1995 through 2012, and then I've been here since. That's basic biographical stuff.
Okay. And you have a wife and two children?
Correct. Yes, I have a wonderful, wonderful wife, Julia, also from New York City area. She's a history professor at NC State. And then two kids, Jonathan, who's 25, and Spencer, who is 19.
Okay. How has the transition been moving from New York to North Carolina? Culturally different? Can you tell us some of the differences between the two experiences?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And right, so I basically most of my life lived in the Northeast. I mean, so New Rochelle. I went to school at Yale. I worked in New York City. I worked in DC. We lived in the Philadelphia area. The one exception was, so for about 5 years, my wife had a job, her first teaching job at Bucknell, which is in central Pennsylvania. And so we moved out there, and I did this sort of commute back and forth. And that was more of a difference for us than actually moving down here. That was really sort of central Pennsylvania, which is, although Bucknell was an affluent place, a lot of the area around is quite poor. Factories have moved away. There's was an odd cultural clash between the Bucknell faculty, the Bucknell students, a lot of Amish and Mennonites who actually are still there, and then local people, who are sort of suffering economically. So that was more, and of course we had little kids at that point. So that was in some ways more of a difficult move or challenging move than coming down here. I mean, Durham is I think geographically diverse. A lot of people, associated with Duke are not from here. Mm-hmm. And obviously North Carolina is an interesting, I mean, it's politically divided, but it is a purple state. So, we really enjoyed being down here. One big concern was moving my son. My younger son was starting junior high school. He was heavily involved with music up in Philadelphia, but it turns out there's a lot of music down here. Yeah. So, it's been a nice move for us.
Absolutely, except for the snakes.
Except for the snakes. That was actually funny. Yeah, we bought this house, and then literally the first week, we put some raised beds for growing vegetables. We went out one morning, and there was half of a copperhead that was caught in the netting. Some kind of animal a copperhead gotten caught in there, and some kind of animal had chewed up the copperhead. And I went out there and I completely freaked out. And I said, because I really had checked out the house, but I had not had any idea about the issue of copperheads. So yes. That's been a change, but
Yeah. Okay. So tell what you teach at Duke Law. I know you mentioned it, but can you expand a little bit about what you teach and your outreach? What is your passion?
Yeah. So I teach. I feel very fortunate. I teach public law. I teach constitutional law, just the basic, first year constitutional law course, and also administrative law, which is sort of the law of federal agencies. So procedural law governing federal agencies. I love teaching. This year has been really hard. I love sort of being in the classroom and, just being engaged and writing on the board and having a back and forth, and moving to online is really hard. I think the upcoming year is going to be hard because of that. And then I do a lot of research. Last 10 years or so, I've done a lot of work on cost benefit analysis, which sounds like a technical thing. I guess it is a technical thing, but it's basically about how government sort of decides, what a good policy is going to be. Like, so for example, environmental regulation. So there are benefits to that, reducing pollution, reducing deaths and health problems, but there are also costs, and how you balance that. And a lot of my work has been about how to do that in a way which is sort of more sensitive to impacts on the worse off, sensitive to the distribution of costs. So yeah, no, that's what I do. And what's nice about the law school is, as a faculty member, there's incredible support. There's a great community. It's been a really good place for me to be doing this.
Let me ask you a question about your research in cost benefit analysis. What's the ultimate? So first, can you explain to us what cost benefit analysis is, and then what is the outcome? What does your research tell us?
Okay, yeah. So cost benefit analysis. The idea is, whenever government is choosing some kind of policy, in theory, you'd want to consider all the different impacts on individuals' well-being. Now, let me just back up. I mean, the reason this is legally relevant is because there's actually a requirement which has been in place, basically since 1980, which says that whenever a federal agency issues a major regulation, it's got to go through this cost benefit exercise. So this actually is, is a very important sort of legal requirement. I mean, not a lot of people may be aware of it. But the idea in principle is, if you're issuing, let's say you're issuing, whatever, air pollution regulation, or you're, approving some kind of medical equipment, or a workplace safety regulation, or regulating cars. You want to consider both. You want, in theory, consider all the effects on people. Now that may be, impossible, but you want to sort of think about the major effects of this policy on people compared to the status quo, both the positive effects, the benefits, and the negative effects, the costs, and then you want to sort of balance those. So that's what cost benefit does. And again, I'm interested in thinking about doing that in a way which is sensitive to effects on people who are worse off. Now, unfortunately, there actually has been a lot of progress. And what's interesting is that although this was put in place by a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, it's been kept in place by every president since. So President Clinton kept it in place. Both Presidents Bush kept it in place, as did President Obama. And it's still in place under Trump, although, to be honest, it's not really clear how important it is, as opposed to sort of just political calculus. But it is, I think, part of, sort of good policy assessment. I mean, one of the things, this is interesting, one of the things now with the pandemic, unfortunately, the Trump administration is not doing it for the pandemic, but it's actually a huge application of cost benefit, right? So, there are big benefits. We're now discovering the big benefits to these social distancing policies. Indeed, early on, it's clear that, looking back at it, that many lives were saved by putting in place social distancing. More lives could have been saved by moving more quickly. On the other hand, it's obvious there's huge cost to that as well, right? And so, it's actually a really good example of the need to balance costs and benefits. And again, with a lot of at least federal law, the costs are really costs in terms of increased, lost income, right? So by, for example, social distancing, people are losing income and losing jobs. And the benefits, a lot of the benefits, at least in terms of the federal government, and this is true with the pandemic too, have to do with life-saving benefits, right? So reducing deaths, extending longevity. So how do you balance, the two of those? That's a hard thing. I mean, people are tempted to say, well, life is priceless. I mean, there's a sense, of course, in which life is priceless, but in terms of the amount that we as a society can pay to prevent statistical deaths, life is not priceless, right? And so, and unfortunately, the pandemic is illustrating that.
Yeah. I have a two-part question. So let me just ask the first part. With cost benefit analysis and your research, do you ever look at the disparities among the haves and the have-nots? Do you consider that as well? And if so, what is the normative, if you will?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So right now, the way cost benefit is done, both in economics and the academic literature, and also by the government, is to sort of measure both costs and benefits in terms of dollars. So which to ordinary people seems a little bit crazy, but this is what is done. So there's something called the value of statistical life, which says, if you reduce someone's risk of dying by a certain amount, you convert that into dollars, right? So if you reduce someone's risk of dying this year by 1 in a million, you're going to multiply that by, say, $8 million, and you say that the monetary value of that reduction is $8.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that, I mean, there are lots of issues with that, but one issue on the cost side is it says, well, it doesn't really matter if for example, this policy is going to cost someone $100. It doesn't matter whether the $100 is the cost for a wealthy person or a middle-income person or a poorer person. It's just $100, and obviously that's not right. I mean, $100 in terms of quality of life, actual well-being, has a much bigger impact if that cost is borne by lower-income people. So indeed, one of the things I'm trying to do in my research, by using weighting factors, is to try to capture that,
Mm-hmm.
to try to see, how we could be more sensitive on the cost side to whether the costs are borne, by wealthy people, by middle-income people, by working-class people, by poor people, and to take better account of that. Mm-hmm. Right now, cost benefit doesn't do that. I actually hoped, when President Obama was elected, he actually, or the person who was directing the Office of Cost Benefit, asked for comments about revising the cost benefit order, and a whole bunch of us, including me, put in comments, and my comment was to that effect, which is, let's really think more carefully about how to account for the distribution of costs, and let's revise the order to require agencies to do that. That did not happen. I'm not sure why. I think because Obama was under this huge political pressure to deal with even bigger things like the Great Recession and like the obstruction from the right. But this would be a clear way in which cost benefit could be improved. And I hope, if we do have a Democratic president, that, well, at least in the near term, it's going to be that president will move cost benefit in this direction.
Excellent. So let me ask you this. So in common vernacular, news stories and all that stuff, you hear about the 1%, the middle class, and those that live below the poverty line. In terms of economics, I think we all understand what that means. The 1% have more money than anybody else. The middle class is just we live paycheck to paycheck, and then there are those who are barely getting by. But when you think about that through the lens of race, what does that really mean in plain English?
Yeah, well, a couple of things, and I'm not an expert on race. I really should be more in listening mode than speaking mode here. The person who is the real expert on, or one of the top experts on race and income, or race and wealth, is Sandy Garrity, who's at Duke, who writes about. So a couple of things. One is, even leaving aside race, the U.S. has become way more unequal, really starting in the 1970s, 1980s, for lots of reasons. For rolling back, income taxes, the disappearance of manufacturing jobs, but the inequality between what people were earning at the high end and in the middle and lower down has increased a lot. Big increases too in the inequality of wealth. So not just what you're making every year. For most people, that's wages, but the inequality of wealth. and that's even worse when it comes to race, right? So I don't know what the numbers are. I'm not gonna, but I believe I'm a little reluctant to talk off the top of my head, but I mean, last I checked, I recall a number like the average wealth of the American household. So that means, assets in the bank, the value of home equity and stuff like that. Let's say that's on the order of 100,000. For white households, for black households, it's maybe 10,000.
Wow.
So the huge differences just in terms of the number, just in terms of money. And that's not even talking about the burden of living with structural racism, right? So, and I'm not going to talk. I mean, there's just a long history of that. I mean, we're hearing now a lot about Tulsa. So, basically, just so-called race riots, stealing property from the black middle class happened in Tulsa. Happened here in Wilmington. Practices such like redlining that prevented, I mean, the huge growth in white, sort of working class, middle class wealth after World War II had to do with real estate, and redlining meant it much more difficult for blacks to get mortgages, and so they were left out of that growth in wealth. Yeah, so that's again, I'm not an expert on that.
But I think your insights were pretty powerful. I mean, that number you just said between 110, that's a major thing.
It's a major. I would hear it say just read Sandy Doherty.
Yeah.
He is the expert on this.
Yeah. When you were talking about Tulsa, I don't know if you read or heard, like Durham had a Black Wall Street too. And the Durham Freeway did away with that. And I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but they did. So, wealth is one of those terms we all hear. Sometimes people associate wealth with greed. And there are all these other kinds of constructs that kind of flow into wealth. For Black and Brown communities, the lack of education about what these things mean, so simply buying stock or, putting money in savings or IRA or whatever it is, these are the kind of things in my mind that are missing for Black and Brown families. So I understand you're not an expert, and I didn't mean to put you on a line as
No.
asking a generic question from the perspective in which you understood. Let me ask this. You want to say something?
No, I agree with you about investing. Indeed, I tell my kids, put money in the stock market. A lot of people don't understand that, right? Yeah. So that's that basic point. And a lot of people, again, there are lots of ways in which people, so my view is, what I say to my kids is, the stock market continues, to grow a lot. I mean, if you look at, actually before my second son was born, there's a Jeremy Siegel, I was teaching at Penn, who's a Penn business school professor, has a pretty famous book called Stocks for the Long Run, and he documented just the incredible returns on stocks going back to the early 20th century. And so based on that, I just kept money in stocks, and I also understood the importance of index funds. Reducing expenses. I mean, if you're in a mutual fund and you have an expense ratio of 1% a year as opposed to 0.1% a year, it doesn't sound like a lot, but over your lifetime, it's a huge amount. So I'm just I feel very privileged. I have that knowledge, and I've been able to implement that. Most people don't have that.
Right.
I mean, then of course having a salary where I can save stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's very important. That's very helpful. So let me ask you this question, and we have about 5 minutes, so I'm not going to talk long, but let me ask you this. So did you see the video of Mr. Floyd dying?
I did.
How did you see that? What did you think when you saw that?
I mean, what's to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for, like right now, we have a lot of people out protesting. It's very diverse. All types of people are joining together to highlight this issue that we, especially as Black communities, have known since 1619, where we disappeared into thin air. We've been hung, we've been shot, we've been killed. families torn apart, and I thought about this very heavily when the Latino immigrants were trying to get into America a couple of years ago, or a year or so ago, and they were separating families from children, which you can go back to slavery and see that exact same thing where parents had their children or their families sold out from under them. And so as a white person, does that ring resonate for you? Does it have any thoughts for you about the condition of the American dream?
Well, I mean, as you say, and again, I should be in listening mode, not speaking mode here, but we have a history of structural racism going back, as you say, to the beginning. And the project of Reconstruction, there was a window between 1865 and 1877 to really change that, and even up to 1890, but that stopped. And we've never recognized that, we've never taught that. I mean, I didn't grow up in school knowing about Tulsa. I mean, Tulsa is described as a race riot. It's not a race riot, it's a massacre. Mm-hmm. It's a massacre. I mean, I'm Jewish, and my, obviously in Europe, not in the United States to the same extent, there's anti-Semitism, but, in Europe, there were periodic pogroms against Jews, and that's what it was. It was a pogrom, and we've had a lot of pogroms against Black and brown people, and no recognition of that, and it just continues. So, what to do? I don't know what to do. I'm not going to begin to speak to that. But this is an enduring, centuries-long history of racial subordination, which is not even recognized.
I would say to you, and I respect you. You have been to my home. I consider you a very dear friend. I would say this: if I could give any advice, do more than listen. Engage conversations. When you guys are hiring a new faculty, are there any Black, brown, or female faculty that could be hired?
Absolutely.
When you are, out and about in society, see the things that are there and raise those. Don't just overlook, well, that's just an incident, or well, that person robbed or whatever they did. There has to be some part where we think, why are these things happening? Because if you go back to early America, especially in the 1900s, there was lots of rioting and looting by white people because, they were faced with, economic injustices. And, we've been struggling with this far more longer and more difficult, but still at the same time, we would not be where we are now if it were not for white people, And, I think you have more than just listening. You have great knowledge. Share it, engage, when you teach your class, teach people about, wealth and cost benefit analysis and all these things, specifically to diverse communities, because probably a great majority of white people already know these things. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. No, but by listening, I don't want to talk to you in particular until talk about the Black experience, the person of color, but that's all. But I absolutely agree. I mean, I think, again, as a teacher, it's important to make this stuff visible, and to talk about, for example, the hypocrisy of glorifying resistance to tyranny in the Tea Party, and then not, saying to Colin Kaepernick when he peacefully tries to protest that son of a bitch should be fired. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me. Yeah. No, we need to. I mean, so race is part of the Conlo curriculum. We talk about it, but we need to talk about it more, and we need to take the steps that you're talking about in terms of diversifying the faculty and student body.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Matt, so much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Good luck and best of health, and I know how much you love technology.
No, not too much, not too little. I use it. It is. I mean, this kind of thing is great.
Yeah. But I'm always here if you need me. And if and when we ever get to join again, we will have dinners, and I expect you to come and tell people all the things that they don't know, because I will tell you, each time you come, someone will tell me how much they learned just by talking to you.
Thank you. You have these wonderful dinners, and the nice thing is we can maybe do them outside at least.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
all
Stay
right.
safe and tell the
Thank
wife
you.
and kids we said hello.
Okay.
Bye,
All right,
man.
Joe.